I'm Dr. Susannah Cornwall. I'm lead researcher on a project at the Lincoln Theological Institute at the University of Manchester called Intersex, Identity and Disability, Issues for Public Policy, Healthcare and the Church. Intersex conditions, as you may know, are conditions where someone's physical sex can't be easily classified as male or female. They have some kind of physical ambiguity in their sex. They might have a combination of the physical features normally associated with males and the features normally associated with females. As a Christian theologian, I'm aware that many Christians believe that all people were created to be male or female in the image of God, and that perhaps intersex therefore presents some kind of problem. If you have someone who's not clearly male or female, or who has features of male and female, does that mean they're not made in the image of God? Or what are the implications of that theologically? I'm also aware that Christians with intersex conditions have had very mixed experiences. Some have found that their faith is very important to them as a source of strength as they navigate life with their condition, and they've been welcomed and supported by their churches. But unfortunately that's not true for everyone, and other intersex Christians have faced a lack of understanding and have had quite negative experiences in churches. Some have even been told that the nature of their condition means that they don't reflect God as perfectly as other people do. Perhaps they're not even fully human. I'm here today at Hughes Hall in Cambridge, at the University of Cambridge, and I'm here with the Reverend Dr. John Hare. And we're going to be talking a little bit today about intersex conditions, about why intersex is an important issue for Christians, and perhaps especially interesting and important to those who are involved in making denominational policy on human sex, gender and sexuality. So, hello, formally, John.
Hello.
So you're an Anglican priest, that's what you do at the moment, well, one of the things that you do at the moment,
Yes.
but actually you have a medical background. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you became interested in intersex?
Yes, I qualified as a doctor long ago in 1964, and my career was largely in obstetrics and gynecology. A generalist, really, in obstetrics and gynecology with no more than a general interest in the condition of intersexuality. The reason I became interested was around the time I retired from clinical practice, when an article appeared in the Church Times, authored by Archbishop Akinola from Nigeria, when he used what I thought was a grossly unfair and provocative description of people in same-sex relationships. A strange two-in-one human, both male and female, or neither male nor female. And at that point, it occurred to me that that was a grossly unfair characterization of people in same-sex relationships, but sadly could be applied to people with intersex conditions. And at that point, I started taking interest in the theological implications of these conditions.
And you did some writing about that?
I did indeed. There was the article in the Church Times, which provoked invitations to lecture and give seminars, and then there was the chapter in the book An Acceptable Sacrifice, which came out some 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And that was specifically thinking about Christian responses to homosexuality, and you were arguing that perhaps intersex was interesting or important to think about within discussions of homosexuality. That's
right. The bulk of the book deals with the situation of same-sex relationships.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, around the time when I first started reading about intersex and started hearing about it, I was really surprised to find out how relatively common it is. So
Yes.
Some scholars think that around 1 in 2,500 children is born with, I suppose, a fairly unproblematically obvious intersex condition where there's some ambiguity of genitals.
Yes.
And then perhaps that there are even more conditions where, there's no genital ambiguity, but there is nonetheless some kind of intersex condition. And I was also surprised during that research to find out that until relatively recently that corrective genital surgery on young children had been very common, and
Yes.
that still happens sometimes. But, I mean, would you tell us a little bit about some of the shifts in kind of medical treatments for intersex that have taken place over the last 10 to 15 years?
Yes. As you said, in the last half of the 20th century, surgeons became very inventive in the treatment that they would offer children with ambiguous genitalia. And the philosophy was very much that corrections, and I use that term advisedly, should be made as early as possible so as to give the child a gender in which to grow up. And obviously that gender had to be decided for the child, largely by the surgeons, with often minimal input from the parents. This produced, shall we say, anatomical neatness often, but took little account of the physiology and the psychology of a person with an intersex condition. As the 20th century approached its end, the patients, because they had been patients themselves, started to complain. They started to complain that not only did they feel uncomfortable in the gender they'd been assigned, but they also felt that in the majority of situations they had the right to play a part in that decision making, or even be the absolute determiner as to that decision. And the medical profession has responded to that to a degree, to a major degree. And so now the policy is much more, let's wait, let's see how the child develops, and whenever possible, let's wait until they reach an age at which reliably they can have an input into that decision.
And part of that process as well has been encouraging parents to perhaps speak to other families who've had children with a similar condition, or to get in touch with support groups and that kind of thing, hasn't it?
There's been a great realisation that the best form of counselling is usually going to come with people with the same experiences. And so the parents of other children and those children, and when they grow up, those adults, are the best people to provide support and advice.
And increasingly as well, hospitals are working with kind of multidisciplinary teams of urologists, gynecologists, hormone specialists, etc.
Yes, in the textbooks that I would have been brought up with as a student and as a young doctor, the idea of an interdisciplinary approach was just not there. It was something that a gynecologist usually, because the usual correction is towards the female form, a gynecologist would do.
And I've come across some people saying that sometimes they thought that an outcome for a child who'd been born with unusual genitals really depended on what kind of expert they met first. So if they met a urologist first, they were more likely to have surgery. If they met an endocrinologist first, it was more likely to be hormone therapy, etc. It seems that the NHS actually, I think, has put quite a lot into ensuring that there are expert teams, and that it won't just be the luck of the draw whether you're born near a big teaching hospital or whatever, but actually hopefully that each child would encounter the best possible care. So one of the other things that's happened even more recently, actually, over perhaps the last 5 to 10 years, has been this question about what's the best or the most appropriate terminology to use for these conditions. So we have different conditions with specific names, but as the kind of umbrella term, it used to be that hermaphrodite was used, and there's been a move away from that. And then for a long time, intersex was the more common term. And now doctors in particular are using this term DSD, short for disorder of sex development. Now, it seems to be that the word intersex is preferred by perhaps activists and non-medical people, and that DSD is preferred by medical people. Could you tell us a little bit about some of those discussions and what you would argue would be the best terminology and why?
Yes. I think an alarm bell rings when the term disorder is used, because it suggests that these people are not right, and that something needs to be done to make them right, to make them as part of ordinary society. So I would fight shy of the word disorder. The problem with intersex is that with the interest in transsexuality, transgender, confusion can arise, and I've found when talking to various groups that if you mention the terms intersex, they immediately lock onto the idea of transgender. So I think the jury is still out on that one, but one must recognise there are weaknesses in both approaches.
Yes. There is an argument, isn't there, that perhaps there are some parents who, when they hear the term intersex, think, well, is that to do with homosexuality? And perhaps might be reluctant to get in touch with intersex groups. And some people would argue that's a reason for using DSD, which seems like a more, I suppose, objective clinical term. I mean, even within support groups, there are groups who I think are coming down on either side. it's interesting to see how quickly the DSD terminology has taken off.
Yeah.
But there are also people arguing that actually DSD could be used, but rather than the first D standing for disorder, perhaps it could stand for difference of sex development or divergence or this kind of thing. So
that would be a possibility,
yeah.
yes.
Mm-hmm. So you've written in the past, as we were saying earlier, a little bit about perhaps some of the implications of intersex conditions for Christian responses to homosexuality, and that was the focus of your essay in An Acceptable Sacrifice. Could you tell us a little bit, more specifically about why you believe it's important that people perhaps making policy for the Christian denominations around sex, gender and sexuality know about intersex or take intersex into account when they're making those kind of decisions?
I think first and foremost, I would say that those making Christian policy, be it the authorities in the Vatican, be it those who govern the Anglican Communion, or be it individual churches, must not be blind to the developments of science. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say science is always right. Sometimes science can be quite tentative, and what is thought to be scientific certainty can be reversed. But there is no question of that happening here. Mm-hmm. So I think for the churches to neglect to take science into consideration, to still work, if you like, on the biblical concept of science, when making policy and making rules and governance, is blatantly flawed. It's dishonest, and theology must be based on truth. If it's not truthful, then it's not practical and good theology. So it's very important that people take this into account. They must then look at the implications, look at the idea of a spectrum of physical, genetic and physiological sexuality as well as psychological sexuality. And within the concept of the overriding love of God, they have to be able to accommodate this. Now, it is very difficult indeed, because it overturns a lot of many centuries of accepted teaching. But it is very important that they do this and that they work on this for the future, because if the Christian Church is to survive as truth, it must do this. If it is to survive simply as mythology or a way of life that is not related to truth, then they don't need to. But if it is to survive as truth, it must take this into account.
And there might be specific implications for areas like marriage law, both within kind of general law but also within ecclesiastical law, who can marry. Yes. Questions about ordination come up as well, don't they?
They do. The question of ordination is fascinating, because if you take androgen insensitivity as a typical syndrome, the person who has this syndrome has some female attributes and some male. She has a female bodily form, often enhanced by suitable hormone treatment, and he has male chromosomes. Now, which of those is going to be the determinant for marriage, for ordination? The churches have not addressed this.
And do you think that's because they have thought about it and don't know what the answer is, or is it more that actually people don't think about this and don't really know very much about intersex or how relatively frequent it is? And
I cannot think that the larger established churches have not thought about it. The material has been there for them to consider. Organisations like the Vatican are very well supplied with people eminent in all professions who are willing to advise. I cannot think that this has not turned up. I think the answer is that they are grappling to find the answer, and until they feel they find the answer, and this doesn't just apply to the Vatican, it applies to other churches as well, they are going to fight shy of making any suggestion or any decision. Having said that, one thing that appalled me about the report, the Anglican report, Some Issues in Human Sexuality, is that no medical advisor can be found on the title or acknowledgement pages. Now, either they didn't have a medical advisor, or the contribution was so insignificant they didn't think it worth a mention. I suspect they didn't have one, and to me that is horrendous.
And the context of this is that this is a kind of summary of some of the debates which had come out from Issues in Human Sexuality, 1991.
That's right.
What's come to be really recognised as an official Anglican statement, although it didn't really have that status initially. And that some Issues in Human Sexuality actually has a whole chapter about transgender, but
that's right.
doesn't really deal with intersex.
Yes. Interestingly, Issues in Human Sexuality, in its recommendations for the future, I think said that advice should be taken widely, including from the medical profession, but it blatantly wasn't for some issues.
Yeah. So one of the things that you've talked about then is that it's very difficult to think that people making policy in the denominations, for example, don't know about intersex or haven't heard anything about intersex. But yes, as you said, there doesn't seem to have been this move towards saying, well then what are the implications in policy for pastoral care and so on. So what do you think are some of perhaps the barriers to Christians taking proper account of intersex and really thinking through how that impacts on their theologies, their ecclesiologies and so on? Why isn't that happening, or why hasn't that happened?
I think there are a number of reasons for that, depending on where the Christian is coming from. If you are a fundamentalist Bible Christian, then you may feel tied to the Genesis statements, male and female, he created them, full stop. Under those circumstances, you may force yourself to live in a double world, where in the secular world you recognise that this isn't as clear as it seems, but in your religious world, and the world which governs your ethical approach and your attitude, it's an absolute. The same could apply to people who feel themselves strictly tied to church teaching, for example, in the Roman Catechism. For people in the middle, there's no reason why they can't take this into their religious life, if they choose to, and some may just not choose to. They may choose to live in a warm glow of a religious experience without actually using it to address some of the problems of life, and follow through as to where that debate leads them. And there is the worry for some people where the debate leads, the domino theory, that once you let something small go, the dominoes start collapsing and you actually start knocking bigger things down. And intersex, as I've suggested, could knock the whole edifice of strictures against same-sex relationships down.
And there seems to be something very fundamental within a lot of Christian theology, that humans are designed to be dimorphic, to be male or to be female, to have gender roles which pin onto those sexes, and that actually if we start to say perhaps even the biological sex isn't as straightforward as that, that, as you say, has knock-on implications.
Yes, I forget the exact wording from some issues in human sexuality. At one place it says, we relate to God definitively as male or female. And to me it was put in a way that meant that if you could not be defined as male or female, you could not relate to God, or your relationship was less than perfect.
Which is very problematic pastorally, I would have thought. And I wanted to come on to talking to you a bit about actually your role as a priest, and as someone who's involved in pastoral care and so on, and cares for people within your congregation and elsewhere. What do you think churches could do or should be doing to make their congregations safe places for people with intersex conditions?
I suppose one way of doing it is to avoid the confrontations that the debates on sexuality are likely to raise, and to build within your church a warm, welcoming, loving, friendly atmosphere that everybody can join in. The danger with that is that people may be going on slightly false pretenses, again using the example of same-sex relationships. This might allow people who are strongly against same-sex relationships, even positively homophobic, and people in same-sex relationships to be in the same church and actually not associate with each other to the degree where those differences come out. So that's certainly one way of doing it, and I think a number of liberal churches probably work that way. The other alternative is for the church, be it a centralised church like the Roman or the Anglican church, or a congregational model of a church, to actually debate the situation through and come to an understanding that these things are acceptable and therefore they can be talked about.
And it seems to be the case that at least some of the people that I've been speaking to, whatever denomination they belong to, if they've wanted to talk openly about their intersex condition, they've experienced life in their local congregation as very positive and very supportive, you know, right from perhaps very conservative evangelical denominations to much more liberal ones, which is interesting given perhaps the differences in some of the official teaching of those denominations. Actually, we could understand it as very positive that people seem by and large to be experiencing compassion and welcomeness at a local level,
yes.
Which is interesting.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about ordination. Now, at the time that we're meeting, the General Synod has recently met, and one of the things that they were discussing was what provision would be in place for people who couldn't accept the ministry of women who are consecrated as bishops.
Yes.
The General Synod is due to meet again in July to perhaps discuss this, and finally we'll see which way things go. Does intersex have specific implications for this consecration of women as bishops?
Yes, it
debate?
does.
Yes,
it does. Because the whole concept that is used by people who reserve ordination to holy orders for people of a particular sex, male sex, is that, or certainly the Catholic concept, is that there is something in the makeup of a woman that prevents the gifts of the Holy Spirit given at ordination and consecration to descend and become embodied in that person. So whatever the intention of the consecrating bishop and whatever the suitability of the candidate, it just can't happen. If that's the case, then there must be a biological explanation. If there isn't, we really don't know who's a man and who's a woman at all. What those who oppose the consecration of women have got to decide is what that is.
Yes.
There's a very well written article a few years ago in The Guardian by a woman called Helen Scully. We can use her name because she put her name to the article, describing her situation. And basically she has male chromosomes, but the bodily form of a woman and the psychological attitude of a woman. Now, do her male chromosomes, would that be enough for the Holy Spirit to descend on her and allow her to be endowed with the office of bishop in the Church of God? Were she a Roman Catholic, which she may be, perhaps she could even become Pope in time.
Yes, that would be interesting.
Yes, you mentioned the debate on women's episcopacy, and it is actually coming down to that. Those who are looking for alternative provision are actually saying, it's not we've got anything against this woman who has gone through the form of consecration, it's just that she's not a bishop, and therefore she can't act as a bishop and oversee a pastor of our church.
Whatever happened didn't happen.
It just didn't happen.
In some way, yeah.
And I think these people must be prepared to say why it didn't happen.
Yeah, and my suspicion is that actually a lot of the people who would want to make that kind of argument don't get to the point of even thinking themselves whether it's to do with the biological maleness or whether it's to do with the masculine gender identity, because there's this assumption that those would always or should always match.
Yes.
So don't necessarily need to get down to brass tacks. Some people would argue that Christianity has, by and large, had these very fixed models of maleness and femaleness, these very fixed ideas about you having to be a man or a woman and you having to have an appropriate gender role. I mean, is there a place for embracing intersex within a faith like this? And if so, what might that look like? What might a Christianity with room for intersex look like?
Well, firstly, one can take an example from the professions. When I started in medicine, apart from outposts like the Royal Free Hospital and the Elizabeth Garrett Anderson Hospital, medicine was very much a male prerogative. And those women who qualified were not expected to rise within the medical hierarchy. There were notable exceptions, of course. Now the majority of medical students are women. I work as a medical expert in the law courts. When I started, there were no women as High Court judges. I was present at one of the first trials that Mrs. Justice Rafferty conducted when I think she was one of the first. Now, women barristers, even as silks, are becoming to be just as common. Women judges are accepted in the most senior roles. So I don't think changes are important. The gender of the ordained ministry should not matter at all. Once a priest, and I speak from someone in the Catholic Anglican tradition, once a priest puts on an alb and a stole and a chasuble, that is not a he or a she. It is a priest, a human being, like us, but acting as a priest and president of the Eucharist. So from that point of view, it shouldn't matter. Over the question of the relationships of the laity, yes, of course, it raises problems, as does the same-sex relationship question of courtship, of relationships, of fairness. But all of these problems could be talked through and experienced in love. Yes, there will be rocky parts on the way, but that is the way progress goes. And we will move towards a more Christian society. I'm not sure who said it. I've seen it attributed to Simon Weil, but I've also heard it was said by Master Eckhart that one should seek truth. If truth appears to lead you away from Christ, you should follow truth, because it will ultimately lead you back. Because Christ is the way, the truth, and the life. I think when one recognises that intersexuality blows apart this clear-cut definition of male and female, one must look carefully about how relationships are formed and regard them as relationships between human beings, not relationships necessarily between people of opposite sexes or the same sex.
And there might be implications, mightn't there, for, I suppose, the Church's self-understanding. You know, the image of the Church as the body of Christ and so on. And what does that mean for the human bodies which make up that body?
Exactly.
And if we're saying that there are some bodies which are more fallen, more problematic, less perfect than others, you know, there are ecclesiastical and also theological implications within that. So some people would look at Christianity and I suppose the history of Christianity, and they would say, on the one hand, we have this religion which is very positive about incarnation, which has incarnation at its centre, which affirms belief in a bodily resurrection and so on, but actually also has this stream which has been quite suspicious of embodiment, particularly of perhaps desire, whether those desires for sex or for food or whatever it is, and which in some senses has been quite ascetic and perhaps quite suspicious of the body.
Yes.
What hope is there for Christianity to perhaps be able to adapt to create a proper place for intersex within it?
I think you've identified a very major, probably the most important factor, which is whether Christianity is an incarnational religion or whether it is a soteriological religion. And many theologians feel that the concept of the incarnation has been totally overtaken by the concept of salvation. So much so that the current theories of atonement are almost all based on the overwhelming sinfulness of the human race and the way in which the function of Christ's incarnation was to deal with that. There is a movement back towards the alternative explanation that the incarnation was the key event, that the incarnation was planned from before eternity, that human sinfulness has nothing to do with the incarnation at all. I think if we could adopt that view, we would look at the variation in human behaviour, variation in human form, variation in human function, in a much more loving light, and use love and altruism, if you like, as the deciding factor. If we can do that, then I think we will be able to grasp these situations much better.
Well, thank you very much for your time, John, and for talking to me today. We're going to draw our conversation to a close there. If you've heard this and you're interested in the Intersex Identity and Disability project at the Lincoln Theological Institute, you can follow the link on this page to go to the project site and to find out more information about the research that I'm doing as part of that. Thank you very much once again to the Reverend Dr. John Hare, and it's goodbye from both of us. Thank you.